Kate Walker rowed into the waters of New York Harbor to pull drowning strangers to safety, and by the time she was done, she'd done it 50 times over. This is the true story of one of the smallest, toughest lighthouse keepers in America. Picture the scene. Wind screaming across the harbor, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. A boat has capsized near a rocky shoal, and the men who were in it are going under, coming up, going under again. Above them, a light turns in the dark, steady, indifferent to the weather, and from the base of that light, a rowboat pushes off. At the oars is a woman barely 4'10", maybe 100 pounds soaking wet, which, very soon, she is going to be. She rows toward the drowning men like she's done it more times than she can count, because by most accounts she has. Her name was Kate Walker. For more than 3 decades she tended Robbins Reef Lighthouse, a stubby little tower rising out of New York Harbor, and by most tallies that survive her, she's credited with personally pulling at least 50 people out of the water and back into the world of the living. 50. Possibly more. Nobody kept a perfect scorecard for a woman quietly doing her job in the dark. But before we get to the rescues, we have to go back to a promise, one made during the worst days of her life, that ended up defining all the rest of them. Kate wasn't born to this harbor. She was born in Germany in 1848 and crossed the ocean like millions did that century, looking for a life that hadn't been written for her yet. She landed in New York and, the story goes, took work in domestic service, cooking, cleaning, the unglamorous labor so many immigrant women did to keep body and soul together in a new country. Somewhere in that life, she crossed paths with a widower named John Walker, an assistant lighthouse keeper at Sandy Hook. The details of exactly how they met have softened and shifted with each retelling. Some versions say she nursed him back to health, but the through line every account agrees on is this: they met, and eventually they married. John's work took them to Robbins Reef Lighthouse, a spark plug-shaped tower standing alone in the harbor, and by the mid-1880s he had become its keeper. Kate, the immigrant girl who once scrubbed other people's floors, was now the wife of a lighthouse keeper, living on a rock surrounded by water, with the largest city in America glittering just out of reach. It didn't last. In 1886, John got sick pneumonia, by most accounts, and was taken back to Staten Island for care. He never recovered. He died soon after, leaving Kate a widow with children depending on her and no clear place in the world. Here's where the story hands down something we can't verify word for word, but that's been passed through lighthouse service lore for well over a century. That as he was taken from the lighthouse, John asked her to mind the light. Whether he said it in exactly those words, no one can prove. But whether he said it or not, Kate lived the rest of her life like it was the last thing he ever asked of her. Here's what makes this story so quietly astonishing. That same year, 1886, within sight of Robbins Reef, the United States dedicated the Statue of Liberty. Torch lifted, face turned to the harbor, the most famous immigrant welcome in the world rising over that water. Robbins Reef Lighthouse sits close enough to see her, close enough that on a clear day the two of them seem to be looking at each other across the waves. Right at the moment Kate's old life ended, the most iconic symbol of American promise was dedicated nearby. History rarely hands you a coincidence this poetic. While tourists sailed past to see Lady Liberty's torch, a much smaller light kept turning in her shadow, tended by a woman almost nobody was looking at. Robbins Reef would come to be known as Kate's Light, hiding in plain sight, in the shadow of the most photographed monument in the harbor. You'd think, given everything Kate had already proven she could do, the lighthouse service would simply have handed her the job. They did not. When John died, the government offered his widow something safer, a shore posting, land under her feet, no more rowing through swells. Kate said no. She stayed on the reef and kept the light running herself, unofficially, for years, doing the job without the title or the paycheck that should have come with it. It wasn't until 1894, 8 years later, that the lighthouse service finally made it official and appointed her keeper of Robbins Reef Light. By then she'd already been doing the work long enough to make the bureaucracy look slow. Life on the reef was not romantic. It was repetitive, physical, and lonely in a way that's hard to picture now. Every night the lamp had to be lit, trimmed, watched. Every day brought fog signals, brass to polish, weather to read. And Kate was raising two children out there, a son, Jacob, and a daughter, Mamie, on a tower surrounded by open water, with no school, no neighbors, no corner store. So on school days, in fair weather and foul, she rowed her children across the harbor to Staten Island, dropped them at school, and rowed herself back out to the light. Then she did it again in the afternoon to bring them home. Rain, wind, ice on the oars, it didn't matter. That commute alone, repeated for years, would count as a remarkable life for most people. For Kate Walker, it was just Tuesday. It was out of that daily grind that the rescues came. A boat in trouble near the rocks, a fisherman who misjudged the current, a capsized skiff in the fog. Kate would see it or hear it and go dropping whatever she was doing, taking the oars, pulling hard toward whoever was floundering in water that could kill a person in minutes. The first rescue probably felt like a singular crisis. By the 10th, it was becoming a pattern. By the 20th, it was becoming a reputation. The surviving accounts rarely preserve every detail of each rescue, but together they capture the shape of them. A vessel would get into trouble near the reef, sometimes throwing men into the water within sight of the Statue of Liberty's torch. Kate didn't wait for help from shore. She got in her boat and rowed toward the wreckage, hauling half-drowned men over the gunwales while the harbor threatened her too. Then she went back to tending her light, because the light didn't stop needing her just because she'd saved somebody's life. That was the rhythm of her whole career: crisis, then quiet; rescue, then routine. The count kept climbing. 10, then something like 20, then, by the time people started actually trying to tally it, somewhere upward of 50 souls pulled from the water over the decades, according to the lighthouse service histories and obituaries that later tried to add it all up. We should say plainly, nobody was standing on the reef with a clipboard. 50 is the figure that stuck, repeated by most sources close to her life and career, and it may be a floor, not a ceiling. What isn't in dispute is that Kate Walker became, without ever seeking it, one of the most quietly effective lifesavers in the history of New York Harbor, a harbor thick with shipping, fog, and danger, patrolled in her stretch of it by one small woman who refused to let people drown within reach of her boat. Word travels, even about someone who never sought it out. Kate started showing up in newspapers, in maritime folklore, in the growing legend of the tiny woman who ran the light under Liberty's nose. She was, by several accounts, offered easier postings later in her career, comfortable land assignments where a woman well into her years might reasonably want to end up. She turned them down. The story goes that she couldn't leave the light, that people out on that water were depending on it, and on her, and that was that. It's the kind of sentiment easy to romanticize and hard to argue with, coming from someone who'd proven it 50 times over. She kept at it until 1919, more than 3 decades after she'd first arrived on that rock, when she finally retired from Robbins Reef. She died in 1931, having lived long enough to see the harbor around her transform completely, steamships giving way to a new century, the skyline behind Lady Liberty climbing higher every year. The light she tended still stands today. It's automated now, no keeper required, quietly doing its job the way it always did, just without a rower attached to it anymore. Kate Walker is not a household name the way the statue she lived beside is. Ask most people crossing the Staten Island ferry today, and they won't know her name, even though they're crossing water she once rowed her own children across, twice a day on school days for years. She is, in the truest sense, an unsung hero, tucked into the footnotes of American maritime history. But that was never the point for her. She wasn't working toward recognition. She was working toward a promise, kept one stormy night at a time, in the shadow of the torch that tells the whole world to send their tired and their poor. Kate Walker was already out there in the dark, doing exactly that, pulling people out of the water, one by one, asking for nothing back.